cover it briefly. Okay, so let me see here. So are we still waiting for people?
The lunch session is still going on. I don't know if you want to do. Does everybody think we should start now, or should we wait like another minute or two?
All right.
Yeah, let's wait like 5 minutes, Alice. The other session's still going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall we start?
I think one more minute.
Okay.
Roslyn is finishing up.
Okay.
Okay, never mind. She's singing happy birthday.
All right. All right. Okay, so welcome. This is the intro to operating Spinnaker training class. And I just have it on the agenda because I was wanting to get some ideas on what people want me to cover in more detail or in less detail, but let's start. And how do I hide my Zoom chat? Oops, sorry. All right. So I am Alice Chen, and I'm a solutions architect for Armory, and I've actually been operating Spinnaker for a while now. I was using Spinnaker at my previous company. And then also helping me facilitate this class is Carlo Mendoza and Michael Brown, also solution architects at Armory. So this is at a high level, this is the agenda of what we'll be going over. A little bit on Spinnaker architecture, a little bit on the networking, and a little bit on basically everything on this list, managing Spinnaker configs, the Spinnaker data stores, and logging, alerting, metrics, and monitoring. So this is a Spinnaker architecture. If you've been to the Spinnaker IO docs site, you've probably seen this before. Just some things that you need to know is that in order to operate Spinnaker well, you have to understand how the architecture works, and especially like how the networking between the different components work. Because this is how you will be able to secure Spinnaker, and then this is also how you'll be able to interact with it. Some things to note are that the green parts deck and the custom API, custom script / API caller. So this is actually deck with the X509 enabled. This is generally publicly accessible. And everything in blue here are the Spinnaker microservices that generally are not publicly accessible. So the users will always hit like deck for the most part. If the users are using a script or API calls, they will be hitting this gate path here. Now, the orange parts are things that sit outside of Spinnaker, but could be actually depending on your setup, it could also be on the same EKS or same Kubernetes cluster as Spinnaker. It really depends on where you put Halyard, but generally speaking, it sits outside of Spinnaker as a whole. I'm not going to go terribly into a lot of details about each particular web service. Is there anything anybody wants me to cover particularly in more detail? So any questions about the architecture? You might have to speak up too if there's anything, because I'm not really sure how this is going to work precisely otherwise. If not, then I'll go to the next thing. Okay, so the next we have networking. So there's you need to know what Spinnaker is going to connect to. And the reason for this is that depending on what it's going to connect to, that will determine whether Spinnaker needs to be publicly accessible. So especially if your Spinnaker is like in the cloud in AWS, like this will determine whether you need a public load balancer or a private load balancer. So what do I mean by what the Spinnaker needs to connect to? Like what version control system, like Git, like which Git system? Is it GitHub, GitLab? Is it privately hosted, publicly hosted? Does it need to, like, where's your data store? Like, what is it? What is that? Where's your artifacts? Is it an Artifactory? Is Artifactory like SaaS? Where is it? Is it, you know, so basically those questions determine what kind of a load balancer you need to set Spinnaker, or, you know, give to Spinnaker. If any of those answers are public, then you will need to make Spinnaker publicly accessible. Otherwise, you can expect the webhook triggers and triggers as such will just not work if Spinnaker's is on a private load balancer. So the next thing is securing Spinnaker. So there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind to secure Spinnaker. So one is that you will need to enable the TLS or SSL for Spinnaker. Now, whether you terminate it at the load balancer or at the pod level is up to you, but that would be like the first thing that you would need to do to secure Spinnaker. But before all of that, your best bet is to secure your like VPC if you're in the public cloud, secure your security groups, secure basically access to the Kubernetes cluster that Spinnaker is going to reside on. So given like all of those things, like together will make Spinnaker more secure. Any questions? Okay. So the next thing to keep in mind when you're operating Spinnaker is you're going to need to manage Spinnaker configs. And how you're going to do this, well, like you have two options right now. Use Halyard as is, like the Halyard CLI, or use the Spinnaker operator, which actually uses Halyard in the background. In either case, you will need to understand how the Halyard configs work. And the reason, as I said, is because the Spinnaker operator actually uses Halyard in the backend. Now, really, like, what you want to know is that, like, the reason you would choose one versus the other is depends on what you're more comfortable with. Are you more comfortable running like how commands, and are you more comfortable like using a YAML editor or just an editor and copy and pasting like configs basically? So there's like benefits to both, but it just really depends on what your workflow is. I have to say though, with Spinnaker operator, you can also use like whatever custom or whatever tooling that you currently use for Kubernetes in general. Like you can use like Kubernetes templating, as in like you could use a Helm, or you could use like Customize to help you manage the configs. But you know, and then you can use whatever Kubernetes like automation is already in place for you to manage Kubernetes. What is this? Oh, so maybe I'll hold on that for a minute. Let me see, where was I? Oh yes, and then the Halyard for the Spinnaker operator, since the Spinnaker operator is also deployed like as either like a Helm chart or using Customize like as you would deploy anything else into Kubernetes, like its life cycle is also managed by those manifests and stuff. So there is something to be said about using the operator. You can put Halyard like itself, like the daemon itself, and run it inside of your Spinnaker namespace in Kubernetes. And you could sort of achieve the same thing, but you would still have to manually, you would have to create the YAMLs, and you would have to create, you know, whatever lifecycle management you want for Halyard, if that's the case. Okay, so the other thing, okay, so the other thing, I'm going to go over is the secret backends. So really, like you should actually be using a secret backend for Halyard configs, because that will let you do the fourth point, which is version control your Halyard configs. You don't really want to have them just sitting around somewhere. It makes them particularly difficult to manage, especially if they have secrets in them. So my recommendation is, so right now, OSS Halyard is capable of supporting, like, I think GCS and S3 primarily. There might be other ones, but I know those two for sure work. So I would highly recommend that you use them. For Armory Halyard, we also have like Vault as a secret backend. So it really depends on what you use, but I would suggest you use one of them rather than none of them. So that way you can do the fourth point, which is version control your Halyard configs. So let me go back to like 3. So like the Halyard config layout is kind of important. Like you need to understand sort of like the directory structure and like what things go where. Specifically like things like your profiles. So I can actually show you. So here's like a typical like Halyard like config setup. So you would have a .how directory, like wherever Halyard is, home.how, and inside of that, like you would have a default directory, history, profile, service settings, staging, and most importantly, the config. So config is like the general config of your Spinnaker. The profiles, anything in profiles override something specific to, like, overrides a specific service. Let's just put it this way. So in this case, like we see I have a cloud driver local, a front 50 local. So all of these override the config that was originally here in config. And then service settings are things more specific, like to the settings of a particular service. So this is like also where you can configure things like the JVM options, like for a particular Spinnaker service, among other things. And so this is for a Halyard config. For operator, like it's a little bit different. You just use one gigantic, well, you use a YAML, and then you would, depending on whether you're using Helm or customize, you would essentially like patch or generate like the full config of this for whatever you want to deploy to Spinnaker. So this is why I said earlier that it is important that you understand what the layout of these config files look like. So this is, so that those are configs. Any questions? Okay. So the next thing you need to take note of is Spinnaker data stores. So question you need to ask yourself is, which data store should I use for Spinnaker? Right now, you minimally have to use one if you just use Redis for everything. However, this is good for development or sandboxing or when you're just playing around with Spinnaker. But as you get more serious about using Spinnaker, or you're going to set it up for your team or stuff like that, like, it is not recommended that you use Redis as the primary data store, mostly because there's a bit of efficiency issues with it, and also because it's technically, or what we've seen anyways in the past, is that most teams have a harder time managing Redis, because if Redis goes out of memory or anything happens to your Redis, like, you're going to lose or corrupt your data store for Spinnaker. And that then leads to a very non-performant Spinnaker, or a Spinnaker that is generating all kinds of very strange errors. So it is recommended that you don't use Redis, if at all possible, when you go to production. There are still services in Spinnaker that will need Redis. I'm not saying that you can get rid of it entirely right now, but if you use Redis in production, like, you should, for these other 3 services here, use something else. That is what is recommended. So that hence the question as to what data store should you use for Front 50, for Cloud Driver, and for Orca. For Front 50, you have the possibility of like S3 GCS or S3 like blob storage, or you can use MySQL. And if you use a database, MySQL, then you should be using MySQL 5.7 or higher. So basically MySQL 5.7.x. For Cloud Driver and Orca, it is recommended that you use MySQL. Any questions? Okay, so the last thing on my list to talk about is logging, alerting, metrics, and monitoring. Okay, so this is not particularly important when you're just starting to play around with Spinnaker, but it is something that you should probably get to know. Because if you have, if you're going to be rolling this out to your team or to a larger team in general, like this is absolutely should be required before you go to production. And the reasoning is that if you do not have these things in place, you will be flying blind in production. Like you would not know like when Spinnaker goes down or it's starting to have troubles until it actually goes down. And that's, of course, not what you want when something is in production. So, so questions you should be asking yourself is, what should I use for log aggregation? This is not absolutely necessary, but what I found out in the past is that if you don't use log aggregation, then you're going to be doing a lot of kubectl logs -f on these pods, and if you have multiple replicas of these, like it becomes very difficult to figure out like where the error is and everything. So the log aggregation will help you aggregate your logs and help you be able to search for errors and stuff like that easier. And so that's why I recommend that you think about setting up a log aggregator. What are you going to be used for alerting? Again, this is not particularly important if you're just playing around, but before you go to production or after you go to production, shortly after you go to production, you should set up some sort of alerting. And reason being, again, you want to know if something is going wrong with Spinnaker before like something major happens to it. And then the last two things are that what will you be used as a metric store, and then what will you be using for monitoring? Now, typically, what we've seen is people are using Prometheus and Grafana. Again, this is not absolutely necessary, but it should be like a necessary thing for production. And mostly so you get insights into what is happening with Spinnaker. It's actually, I would say, if you're kind of serious about running Spinnaker, like you should set these two up at the very least earlier rather than later. So you start getting an idea of how Spinnaker is behaving, at least in your environment, because everybody's environment is slightly different. And so there's not really, I would say, there's like trends to look for in Spinnaker, but there's not there's no absolutes that you're looking for either of these things. So the longer time you have a history of these things, then you can see like the dashboards and things like that, the better for you. And as for monitoring, like what should you be monitoring? Everything. Okay, so, and I'm joking, but I'm not joking, because your SLA for Spinnaker will only be as high as whatever you are connecting to Spinnaker. So, and whatever like Spinnaker lives on. So like your Kubernetes cluster needs to be monitored. Your networking to that Kubernetes cluster probably should be monitored. Your Kubernetes like worker should be monitored if it's different from the master. And then like your data stores, like whatever data stores like you have set up with Spinnaker, all of those should be monitored. And if your SLA is only going to be as high as whatever underlying things that Spinnaker is like on, right? So like if your data store is not particularly isn't particularly HA and it goes down all the time, then that will be the availability of Spinnaker itself. So keep those things in mind. And then other than that, like the community has provided like some, I think, yeah, there's some like Grafana dashboards here. Spinnaker IO setup monitoring supply dashboards. And then these are two links that I found useful in the past. Their blogs on the Spinnaker IO website from Rob Zeiner on like monitoring and on metrics and how to interpret these things. So that's pretty much all I have. So I'll answer questions now. Probably make
Alice, there were a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the chat. We answered a lot of them. Justin jumped in on a couple of them. One of them was about metrics.
Yeah.
Sidecar containers or examples for collecting that. Are those in those posts that you've put on the slide?
So actually, there's just a config you need, so if you're using Grafana and Prometheus, or basically if you're using Prometheus, there is like a monitoring like daemon, I think, that you just have to enable in Spinnaker. Like there's a config essentially that will enable those daemons, and once those daemons are there, then it should start streaming the metrics for you.
All right, cool. There's a question about Aurora based on AWS. You might talk a little bit about that.
Okay. What's the actual question about Aurora?
It was just, is it okay to use? Is there any?
Oh yeah. So for RDBMS for MySQL, especially for Amazon, like I actually recommend that you use Aurora. It has a much better HA, and its ability to do like disaster recovery to a different region is better. You do have to use the 5.7x version of Aurora though in order for this to work. But if you don't want to use Aurora, it's fine. You can also use the RDS MySQL. It's just that the version has to be 5.7 or above. Any other questions? Okay, so if you want to do multi-region, a multi-DC, so Spinnaker is not yet capable, I think, of being active and active, not as of yet. I think this is on the roadmap though, so eventually Spinnaker should be able to run in active mode. But basically, in order to set it up in this way, like you have to make sure your data stores are being replicated to the other regions, and then make sure your Kubernetes cluster is like pre-configured in the other region. But other than that, like as long as you save your configs or your Spinnaker configs, like for one region, like all you have to do is when you go to a different region and bring up Spinnaker, you just need to change your references to all your data stores. Armory actually has on our docs website like some instructions on what to keep in mind at least for AWS. We don't have a similar one for Azure and Google, but that will be coming out sometime later. Any other questions?
The other question I think we didn't necessarily touch on too much was about upgrades and about how you do upgrades, Spinnaker, what that looks like, downtime, things like that.
So, when you're doing upgrades, so really like all you do in the config for Spinnaker is you just change the version number. Or if you're using Halyard, you can run a command to do it, but it does the same thing. It changes the version number from one thing to the other. Now, as to downtime, typically there's not much of a downtime unless something does not come up. Because like Spinnaker, when it's redeploying itself to a new version, it's typically quite good at rolling out the new changes basically to Kubernetes. So I've never actually really found that there's a major downtime unless there's some very interesting regression from one version to the next. So downtimes during upgrade is not really a huge concern for Spinnaker. It's, as I said, it's pretty good. It's only really your only downtime is if you have problems with your data store, then you are going to have downtime. Like trying to fix that is usually where most of the time lies.
I think for me, the only one that I have seen is like doing like a complete deployment, like it spin up like a new pod for all of the services, and the cluster ran out of IPs basically, and it was like in a stocks place.
Yeah.
But I think that's like once on like, I don't know, hundreds of times like upgrading it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also another reason why I don't generally suggest using the Spinnaker cluster to be used for anything else other than Spinnaker. And really, please do not put your Redis or your MySQL on the same cluster. It generally does not lead to good things.
And also,
For development, you're perfectly fine, but
and also I've noticed one problem on a client side because we use OS2 authentication. I've integrated with Azure ADD. So if you upgrade Spinnaker, client has to clean up browser cache because it still remember old token for OS2 authentication, and they have to like kind of like relog into Spinnaker. So
yes, that is true. The fiat when enabled does you generally do need to do that. Like I think previously I just notified the user we're going to do an upgrade and please force refresh your cache. Force them to relog in. It's just good to notify the users even if nothing is really going to affect them. But yeah, this will force the token refresh and then they won't have nearly as many problems. I totally agree. Anything else? Schema change and rollback.
On
So
Spinnaker
far,
itself. Yep.
You're talking about the database. You mean so far as I know, like Spinnaker manages that for you. I'm not sure. I never actually rolled back far enough where this has created any trouble. Let's put it that way.
Got it. And real quick, follow up on the previous question about force reloading your screen due to the fiat token. What's the other alternative apart from notifying everybody? Or
so far as I don't know, I guess the other alternative is put that as an issue in OSS Spinnaker and see if someone has a more clever workaround or has a way to like fix it. Because there might be just something that could be done, like either like for the fiat cache or something that would just force it for everybody every time an upgrade happens. But I would suggest that an issue in OSS be created for it.
got it. Thank you.
Anything else? Nope.
Sorry, real quick. So in terms of deploying Spinnaker to a big, big company, large number of developers, well, what's the best practice there? Do you have one for everybody and you just scale horizontally, or do you have, one for like a 500 developers, or is there a magic number on that? What's the best practice?
Generally speaking, is to stay with one Spinnaker for as long as possible because the overhead of managing multiple Spinnakers is a bit of a challenge. Spinnaker is actually quite good at scaling horizontally for the most part. So the only thing to keep in mind is that as you grow bigger and bigger, especially if you start getting into like hundreds of developers, you're probably going to need to use the HA mode. I double quote those HA mode like thing because I don't really consider that HA, but more of a like traffic routing mode for like Cloud Driver and Echo. So like they have HA modes, which will split like Cloud Driver into read only, caching, and some of these other couple of different other configs. And it will make it more efficient essentially in doing, basically it limits Cloud Driver, instead of doing like 3 different tasks, it does only 1 task at a time. So it becomes a bit more efficient, and then you can also scale the number of those things out. Same for Echo. But really, like, that's what you would need to keep in mind. Other things is that, well, for fiat, you depending on how many people, like fiat definitely has to like scale out. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to handle all of that. But most of the other services, they scale out horizontally relatively well. And if they're not, if we're hitting issues, like that would be something that should also be opened as an issue in OSS Spinnaker. And then I think like the there's a SIG ops. There's a SIG for operations essentially. Like they will probably take a look at that and see what's going on. And of course, more details the merrier when you open these issues.
Got it. And any immediate concern on deploying Spinnaker in a distributed geographical fashion, or?
What do you mean? Like you can, like in Amazon, it's always recommended that you set up like the cluster, like the Kubernetes cluster and the workers, and make them like HA in the region. So that means like you do like availability zones, right? You've set up the workers in AZ A, B, C, or whatever 3 you want to pick, at least. And then same with the master and some of these other things. But are you talking about cross region or single region?
Oh, sorry, I'm talking about in on-premise hardware. And if we, want to distribute, West and East for HA, any sort of traffic latency requirement that needs to be addressed, or?
I don't know. I would just say it probably just shouldn't be too much, but I don't know what too much is. But you would do the same setup like within a data center as you would do with availability zones in Amazon, right? So think of East as A, and then maybe West as B, and then Central as C, or something like that, and one worker in each. But I don't know what latency requirement is necessary to do that. Like all I can say is probably a good way would be to try to set up a Kubernetes clusters like that and just check it out and see what happens. Now the only thing is then, like if you set it up this way, then you would probably need to have everything scaled out to at least 3 replicas, just so that, because it doesn't help if you have workers in 3 regions but there's only 1 copy or 1 replica of all these different services, and they're all in different regions. It doesn't help at all, because that means if 1 region fails, you're still going to have a failure in Spinnaker. So you would need to make sure probably at least have 3 replicas, 1 in each region for each microservice, if that makes sense.
Yep, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Nope. All right, so that's it. I'll be on the Spinnaker gardening channel, or the training channel mostly. You can ping me if you have any questions, or I will also be taking a look. My handle is ALCHEN, so you can find me there if you have any more questions. Thank you, everybody. It was great talking to you. Let me stop my sharing.